Hello, happy Wednesday. Um, my name's Fiona English. I'm the Executive Director of the King's Head Theatre. And so for those of you who might not know what that means, hopefully I can give you a bit of an oversight into what my role does and what it looks like. Also taking any of your questions, you're welcome to ask me absolutely anything about what it's like running a venue, maybe what an exec director does that's different to an artistic director, why we have exec directors and exec producers at other venues, or maybe if of interest to you, how I got here and how I got my role. Maybe it's a path that you might be interested in. So I might start just with that as a background, a bit about who I am and how I got the role that I've got today. So I've spent 10 years in arts fundraising before this role. I've been at the King's Head for 3 years as the executive director. I'm also, for those of you in a more corporate world, I'm also the King's Head's chief operating officer. So Adam Spreadbury-Marr, our artistic director, is the King's Head's chief executive officer, and together we run the venue in its entirety. The kind of simplified version of my role is, as most venues have 2 people who look after them, one kind of business role and one creative role, and I'm the kind of business person at the King's Head. But really what a lot of that looks like is both looking after key stakeholders and also thinking a lot about our staff team, and then also thinking a lot about our strategy. And while Adam, our artistic director, looks after a lot of our programme and a lot of the creative output of the venue, I'm often thinking about, well, where will the King's Head be in 10 years' time and how will we get there? As I said, I've been in development, which is ultimately fundraising. It's not really necessarily the same. We often use the word development because we're thinking about longer term strategic relationships rather than just the instant here and now of cash. And ultimately in arts organisations, when we talk about development, we really are looking for 2-way relationships with people. So we're not looking for you necessarily to just text donate and us to never talk to you again, but we're looking at how can we have relationships with people, be that £1 a month all the way through to people giving far more than that. And so before I was at the King's Head, I worked for the Gate Theatre, which is another pub theatre over in Notting Hill, as their head of development, and I looked after for them roughly about £350,000 of fundraised income a year. I was there 2 years, which was amazing. Most of the time I was there was under the old artistic director, Christopher Hayden, and the fabulous executive director there, Claire Slater, who now is at the Donmar. Chris is now the artistic director of the Rose in Kingston. Really brilliant minds and brains, and definitely they taught me a lot about the power of small theatre and how I think in particular how theatre could really operate within a community. That community not necessarily just being the people who live in the vicinity around you, but also a community of artists and a network of staff. And I think that really changed a lot of my opinions about theatre, and definitely was the reason why I decided that, yes, executive director was the role I wanted to do. So before I was at the Gate, I spent a year working for a festival. I had a bit of a curveball year, partially to see if I was interested working more for something like an NGO. I was really interested at the time in not-for-profits and the charity sector, and continue to be so to this day. And so went to work for a festival called Greenbelt, which is an arts, faith and social justice festival, heading up comms, marketing and fundraising for them, which was brilliant. But I would say the biggest thing it taught me was that I didn't want to not work in theatre. It was an amazing year, really fun to put on a festival. And the festival itself is incredible. If you've not seen it, definitely check out their content. They do some incredible stuff. And I loved being a part of social justice conversations in particular. Worked with some of our key funders at that festival included Christian Aid, so one of the biggest NGOs in the UK. And that was really interesting for me to work out, was that a kind of career route in the future I might like to work for an organisation like Christian Aid, and thinking about poverty relief. And I think at the end of that, I came away thinking that I still believed in the power of ideas to change lives. And that was something that I was still so passionate and excited about, and that creativity for me was, and storytelling was really vital in how we can change the world, rather than for my particular place having the kind of instant power to change mindsets and change decisions. So I think, yeah, I came away from working for a festival thinking, get me back to theatre. Before I worked for Greenbelt, I worked for the Old Vic in Waterloo in London, which was amazing. I was there 2 years as well. And I was there working on their capital campaign. So in fundraising, we have two words that we use to describe different types of fundraising. So revenue is the kind of regular year-on-year stuff. And then capital is when we're doing big projects. Normally that's around buildings. And obviously, for those of you who know the King's Head, capital is something that we're working quite actively on at the minute. The King's Head is trying to move into a new building. We currently reside at 115 Upper Street in Islington, at the back of a Young's pub. And while Young's are absolutely amazing landlords to us, we're really fortunate in having great relationships with the pub. It is a short license that we exist on, and we don't have any permanence around our home. And the rent model is really hard, especially at a time like now. I think it's quite a good example to prove that relying on earned income from ticket sales alone is tough when you don't have ticket sales. And so for a while, the King's Head Theatre's board has been looking at, well, what does the future look like for the King's Head, and how can we survive with a slightly better balanced business model? And so one of my key roles is around moving us into the new space. That's a £3.5 million fundraising campaign. And so far, we've raised £2 million. So most recently, I was responsible for the King's Head Theatre's successful good growth application from the Mayor's Regeneration Fund. And so my role covers everything from fundraising for something like that to thinking about, well, what will the change be that will exist in the new building? Not only how can we write a funding application, but what does the actual strategy look like to have a venue that is unique and a venue that is accessible and interesting and diverse for people in the future. So that's some of what I do. I mentioned earlier, but another huge part of my job is looking after our staff team. We have an incredible staff team at the King's Head, and as with all arts organisations, that's quite varied in the makeup of who works for us. So while we have kind of regular 10 till 6 staff, as any organisation would, we also have everything from 0-hour staff who look after our box office and a lot of our technical requirements, through to obviously a huge and varied mix of freelancers that we work with. So we work with freelancers both in our office team, but also all the way through to obviously the creative work that is put on stage. And I'm always trying to think not only about how can we look after people in the present moment, but also how can we be more groundbreaking about how we look after people in the future. And I think a real challenge being a small venue is to not try and look to big venues and simply copy them, but to instead try and be the groundbreakers and the industry leaders. Because I think that there's an ability that we have in small venues to model best practice, and then in turn to be able to say to large organisations, look, we've done this, it's really successful, why don't you try it as well? And that's something that's really fun in my job, but also definitely pretty nerve-wracking, taking the risk and trying things that you're not sure if it will or won't work, but you're interested to see if it could. And with that, we're always trying to think about everyone as having equality, and everybody as having a voice and a reason to be in our venue. And I think that's something that is an interesting challenge. How do you remove hierarchy and make people feel equal, while also trying to run ultimately a successful charity? And there's another challenge in that, in my role, in that we're not looking to make profit. So we have to make decisions often that are a bit counterintuitive sometimes. We're always talking about things like how we're going to break even on shows, and how shows can help achieve artistic excellence, or launch a new talent, or reach maybe a different audience group that hasn't had something put on in the theatre for them recently. And some of my role also tries to cover that, thinking about audience development. So what will audiences look like in 10 years' time? It's a really interesting question, particularly with what we're going through right now. I have a master's in performance and multimedia, and a huge part of my master's focused on imagining theatre in non-theatre settings. So a strange world to currently have a master's where I had to create a theatre in a platform, maybe people don't remember, but Second Life, a kind of form of The Sims, almost like a live Sims where you could interact with others. So I had to create theatre in that setting and explore, did it work, didn't work. And about 10 years ago, I would say our industry was really fixated on the fact that film and television was killing the industry, or maybe strangling it. I don't think we think that anymore. I think we realise the power of live art, and that there is something innate about connection in a face-to-face setting that just can't be replaced. I think we believe and understand that storytelling is a vital part of who we are, and that we're made for connection. And that ultimately is where theatre sits in all of our lives. It has the ability to more powerfully tell stories and make connections than just through a screen. And definitely something that is therefore such a challenge at the minute, when you're not able to have that experience of storytelling, that experience of interaction and engagement. And yeah, it's an interesting challenge for us right now. How do we still create connection for people? How do we still give people access to art in a really accessible way, when we know that we also, at the same time, to keep people well, want to reduce screen time and encourage people to be outdoors? I definitely think that's a really interesting thing. And hopefully these 30-minute live videos that we're doing each day are helpful and a form of connecting with you, so that you feel that you're connected but not distanced. So I'm not really sure what else to talk to you about my role. Maybe you have some questions about what it's like to run a venue like the King's Head, or what it's like to be an executive director, or maybe, if you're interested, how to become an executive director, if that's a career route that you're interested in. Also, obviously, because my background is arts fundraising, perhaps you have questions about fundraising now that I might be able to answer. So I'm just going to scroll through and see if we've got any questions. Okay, so just a question from Michelle here. Thank you, Michelle. On what's the best and worst part of being an executive director. So I got told by Claire Slater, who was my wonderful exec director at the Gate. She taught me a lesson in management that I think has to be the toughest thing about being an exec director, which is there's always a line between the people that you manage, where you have to draw a line between being their friend and being their boss. And I think that's really tough and horrible, and exists both, I would say, for actors that we work with, directors that we work with, the staff team. I'm not very good at drawing that line. I'm really passionate about the people that we work with. They're all incredible and I think wonderfully unique, which is what's incredible about our industry. People are so varied and so different. But I definitely think that it can be really hard when you're the person who has to make tough decisions. So the crisis that we're going through at the minute, how do you be an organisation that is resilient and makes financially sustainable decisions for the charity? How do you ultimately ensure that the charity survives? Sometimes at a cost of people's mental well-being. The King's Head right now is looking at furloughing its staff, which my team will know. that's not news to them, but that's really hard. How do you say to people, you know, we love you and we love the work that you do, and we really believe that people need art right now, but at the same time say to people, but I have to prioritize the charity. I think those kind of big decisions where the charity becomes a bigger, more important person almost is really tough. But also the stuff where then later down the line is probably some of the best things about the role. When I joined the King's Head, we'd never received a grant that was more than about £500, I think it was, and at the same time we'd never had reserves for our charity, so we didn't really have any contingency plan for what happened if things went wrong, and that meant that we would have to quite regularly look at stuff like cash flow and consider if we could still afford our staff on probably a 3-monthly basis. And I would say that's a really true everyday reality for really small venues. You just don't have the ability to build up reserves. You don't have the ability to be able to make long-term decisions. And one of the best things about my role has been the ability to change that. There wasn't an executive director before me at the King's Head, so nobody had the headspace to kind of think about that or make those decisions. And definitely sitting in the crisis that we're in now and thinking about how we can, especially with support from our amazing board of trustees, but how we can plan for 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, however long it takes us to get through this period is really amazing, rather than thinking about how do we shut down the King's Head. And that's not to sound scary, it's just more to say that's actually where I really enjoy my role, is thinking about how can we be radical? How can we be transformative? How can we ensure survival? But also how can we make sure that people are well through all of this? So I think, yeah, hopefully that answers it. Definitely as well, obviously, I've just seen Lee say thank you for our grant, but it would be nuts of me to say that probably the career highlight I've ever had so far is receiving a call from Adam, our artistic director, to say that we've been successful in getting the money from the mayor, so £800,000 of funding to move into our new space. I mean, that's money that a venue of our size really does see as absolutely transformative. It's roughly the same as our annual turnover. So to imagine that the mayor can see the impact that we have and that the ability that we have in the new space, and that kind of money is not really available or accessible to a venue like us very often. So to achieve it is just so enormous, and is definitely a real career highlight at the minute. I've been asked, when did you decide you wanted to be an ED? Well, if I'm honest, I think I've probably always known, but I would say that exec director jobs and executive producer jobs, which is the kind of, as I said, the kind of the quiet, silent partner, I would say, to artistic directors. They're not talked about often, and I probably thought when I was younger that I wanted to be an artistic director because I didn't know that my job existed. So ever since I found out it existed, it's definitely been a job that I've wanted. I'm quite aware of what my own skill sets are. I really love managing people. It's something I'm good at, and I enjoy doing. I love strategic thinking. I love long-term business planning. And definitely when I was even at school, got challenged a lot on my very nerdy academic brain being wasted in theatre, which is heartbreaking. And to anyone who has heard that as well, I'm like so sorry for you at the confusion that often our schools go through to try and divert us into other careers, when the arts is such an amazing place to use your intellect. So I think I definitely found it hard when I was younger to work out how I could use what ultimately was kind of a passion for business in my heart for the arts. So it's lovely that I found the role, I think, that suits both those parts of me. It's definitely interesting if being an executive director or executive producer is something you're interested in. Before I got this role, I spent a lot of time with the wonderful Rachel Williams, who is the executive director up at the Park in Finsbury Park. And her challenge to me was to find a role that really fitted who you are and who your background is. There's so many different iterations of this role, and different requirements that that organisations need. Definitely the King's Head was looking for someone with a strong fundraising brain. And so I feel like I fit in really well in this organisation because I was kind of easily able to step up into something that I was already very confident at. The King's Head also needed someone specifically who understood capital and had been through capital projects before. This is actually my third capital project that I've worked on in my career. And I've also looked at some venues that I've worked for have been in kind of early stages capital planning as well. So capital is kind of the bit of fundraising I'm most confident with as well. So it's really nice to be able to be in a role where the kind of biggest part of my job and the part that is most integral to the King's Head is definitely my comfort zone. So the lovely Layla has asked, what are the challenges of running a Fringe venue in London in normal non-coronavirus times? Do we even remember what those times were like? I'm certainly starting to forget. I definitely think the thing I find personally the hardest is other organisations and other individuals, Arts Council Twitch, I would call it. So the assumption that the Arts Council will cover you, understand your plight, and are representative of you. I think the Arts Council is brilliant, and I do really passionately believe in the power of big Arts Council funded venues, and smaller ones as well. They make incredible work. The venue I worked for before this was Arts Council funded, but it is so different to work for a non-Arts Council funded venue. And I think we're often fighting against instantly having to justify why we should exist when we aren't justified in the bracket of being an Arts Council venue. I also think it's hard, therefore, for people to understand that our income looks very different. And so regularly we're having to work out, well, a third of our income doesn't come from the government. So how do we fit that gap? It's always hard as well, I would say, in a time like this where people group together arts organisations as those funded by the government. As a non-government funded arts organisation that is still charitable, that can be really hard. But at the same time, the King's Head has such an amazing pool of donors that the kind of overwhelming groundswell of support that we've had in the last week makes that actually not so tough. Our donors have gone above and beyond to ensure that we will survive and get through this. And that's definitely pretty humbling, I would say, to watch. I've been asked by Alex, what's your favourite part of the King's Head that's different to other venues? So I'm really, really passionate. If you're a young company or a young theatre maker, I'm really passionate in finding your USP, so your unique selling point. And that's quite a corporate marketing term to bring into perhaps a charitable world, but I think it's so important. You have to find what makes you unique, what makes you different to others, and what your unique opinion is. And that in turn will breed into what your audiences look like, and how you can have a voice and a platform in this world that is valid and valuable. I definitely think the King's Head has real equity in its space. So I believe that anyone, as long as they're really passionate about what they're creating, has the ability to be on our stage. And I think that's really exciting. I don't think that's true of many spaces. I think there's a lot of red tape, or obviously a really long time to get onto other stages. Whereas ultimately, if you're passionate about the project and you can justify it to us, then it might only be for one night, but you can have space at the King's Head. You're welcome. And I think that's really powerful, because that stops us as the people who run the venue from defining taste necessarily. It creates more space, and in turn sees incredible projects come through the ranks that you wouldn't necessarily think would be amazing, but go from kind of one night slots all the way through to maybe 1 week late night, all the way through to main shows. And that's really inspiring, because shows that you might think, oh, I'm not really sure if that would work, actually you can be really challenged on. And the audience that might come through the door for it might be people who would never normally engage with theatre. And so even stuff like the brilliant late night show that was produced by Laura Elms over Christmas. There was a Voldemort parody show from Harry Potter. That might be something where you'd think, oh, that's maybe that won't be that popular. It was hugely popular, and wonderful to see such a young audience, particularly who said, oh, we don't often go to the theatre, coming in to see theatre. That's really exciting, and I think is where the King's Head has real power. I also believe that the King's Head is really radical in its opinions around equality, and specifically around LGBTQ. And we're passionate about everyone believing that they're welcome at our venue, and everyone having the ability to have their story told on stage. And that will never change. That's a core part of who we are and will continue to be. I've been asked by Richard, how many Fringe venues have EDs? They're quite rare, aren't they? Yeah, I think that's really fair. I think the interesting thing is always the question of what makes a venue a Fringe theatre. And that's hard to tell. It's really hard to work out where are the lines and the boundaries between in non-subsidised venues. So when I say subsidised, I mean that the Arts Council in some way gives some kind of regular grant, not always the Arts Council for really big venues, that might be DCMS instead, but ultimately they're getting some kind of government funding, or maybe local authority funding, but they're getting kind of regular money that isn't contingent on projects, or it's supporting their core costs. So we're not subsidised, we don't get any of that kind of regular income. We have some amazing grant makers who have given money into our capital campaign, so our future new building, but our regular stuff isn't funded. It's funded by individuals in the community, ticket sales, and anything else we can do to increase our earned income. But I think that question of what makes a venue a Fringe venue, what is the non-subsidised charitable sector of the theatre, like where are the boundaries for them? And there's some huge organisations that aren't subsidised that you might not realise. So the Old Vic is a non-subsidised venue, and having formerly worked there, that really helps a lot of what I do today, I think. That difference in how do you talk to donors, how do you ensure your survival. But I do think that if you want to step up, if you as a venue want to go through change, and if your turnover is increasing, then definitely an executive director starts to become quite necessary. That said, there are some really tiny, wonderful little venues that do have executive directors. So Busy Day over at the Other Room in Cardiff, which is a fab, tiny pub theatre there that makes just the most beautiful work, is a really wonderful ED working for a really small venue. So it always depends on the organisation, and I think the real question is how much is your executive director prepared to do, which is usually a lot, and of all kinds of diverse jobs. So Layla's asked, what's the difference between an exec director and an exec producer? Great question. I'm aware I keep saying either or. So really there's about 5 different departments that exist in theatre. So we have creative, which also covers producing. So that's kind of all our output and work that's being made. We've got our marketing and comms, which looks after what we say to our audiences, how we communicate about ourselves, what our audiences will look like in the future. And that in turn also then leads on to the third, which is kind of box office. So how we interact with audiences, how we engage with them. We have development, which is the kind of big, chunky fundraising. What do the other forms of earned income look like? And there are far more in lots of departments, but just to generalize, the 5th one is technical. So all forms of output that then that will help behind the scenes on stage. And those 5 departments kind of cover, in some ways, are split out between either the ED or the AD. There's other things as well that are hugely important to what we do. So we have a finance department as well that is vitally important. At the King's Head, we don't have a staff member in role there. We work with a brilliant freelancer, but for other organisations, that's a kind of another chunky piece of meat in your output and your work. But the split out between the artistic director and the executive director or producer will ultimately define if it's an executive director or an executive producer role. So I don't look after producing or creative at the King's Head. That's looked after by Adam, our artistic director. It's not my background, and we have a phenomenal producer, Michelle Barnett, who is perfectly confident to run and be a very successful member of our mid-management, and doesn't need an additional ED support above her. But if I did look after producing, I would be the executive producer. I, in turn, really focus far more on strategy, business development, and fundraising. And that's kind of more classic, I would say, executive director makeup. But really, it's that split, who's defining. You might not know from as an outsider, but our wonderful artistic director has an MBA and therefore looks after finance for our organisation rather than me as executive director. So it's always, I think, organisations work that split out based on who has what skill sets and who kind of has the talent and background for it, rather than trying to fit square pegs into round holes. And Ian has asked, where do you see the King's Head in 10 years' time, and how do you feel the new venue will change the unique feel of the King's Head? Great question. I really think that the two things that we're missing in the UK's theatre scene is a regional hub for artists in London. I think we talk to journalists in particular, but also our industry in terms of scouting and future talent. People are less and less inclined to travel to the regions than they were 10, 20, 30 years ago. And that's causing a real problem, in particular for large regional venues that have beautiful main stages of often 1,000 seats or more, and much smaller studios. How do you bridge the gap between the studio talent that's coming out, young artists, and their main spaces, without London stealing those artists? And that's one thing that we really passionately believe the King's Head's new space has, is that ability to work with big regional venues, work with their exciting emerging talent that is coming out of those talent development schemes, and then fire them back to the regions rather than wanting them to stay in London. We're really excited about that as a project, and we think that there's real space and voice for that. And one of the things that is so exciting about the new King's Head space is the elongation of life cycles working with artists. So someone can come and maybe do a studio show for one night. That might in turn turn into a 1 week run of a studio show. They might try one night in the main space from there, and all the way through that suddenly might exist in a 6-week main show slot. And I don't think there's many venues where you're able to stay. I think the life of a creative in London involves a lot of flitting about between spaces and not having a home. And that's the second thing that we're really excited about, is this view that people can be trained in our building at any age and any scale of their career. And they can find a place to be trained, to be ultimately given vocational opportunities to learn on the job, and to grow with the scale of the building. So you don't have to come in and just do your 3-week show and then go and try and find another venue, but maybe you could be in our venue for 2 years and actually find real growth and development within that time. I do also believe that there's 3 main programming streams that we ourselves make, and I think those will continue to be important parts of who we are. So revivals of shows that aren't often seen, opera done in new contemporary ways that are truly accessible for everybody, and that's even more exciting as we look at stuff like the Royal Opera House opening up its content online at the minute, the Met opening up its content. Really exciting to think about. And what if this was changing the face of who new opera audiences were for the future? What if people are engaging with opera for the first time right now, and then really wanting opportunities to maybe send their kids to opera for the first time? Like, if you're 16, you probably don't want to watch a 3.5-hour opera which involves an aria of someone dying for 40 minutes. So how instead can we make it accessible for you, make it fun, make it contemporary, but not dumb it down? And that's something we will always be passionate about. And the third is, as I mentioned before, so LGBTQ plus work. And I think that will continue to be something that is at the heart of the new King's Head. Really excitingly as well, by having our new space, we have the power to be even more accessible. We're not bound by the pub's rules on what accessibility looks like. I mentioned before, our landlords are amazing, but we have different kind of requirements as to we're able to partner. There's a fantastic Met and Camden project called Safe Spaces, which is around making sure that people feel really, really welcomed in spaces. The kind of final note I'll end on is, I guess, the King's Head's future challenge, and in 10 years, our real aim and passion is to continue to welcome those who don't believe theatre is for them, to really create civic space. So to challenge positive loitering, to make it something that it's totally all right to just come hang out in our space, as church buildings continue to be potentially places that people feel uncomfortable loitering in, or are closing across the country. There's some amazing counter bucks to that trend, but and as libraries kind of don't have the cool factor that they did when I was 12. Maybe they were never cool. I'm a bit of a nerd, but how do we encourage people that they're welcome to loiter, that space is for them, and that there's community space in their area that's theirs? that kind of civic hub. And I think that's the big challenge for the King's Head in 10 years, is to really become a space that in the heart of Islington welcomes everybody, even if they never see a show with us. And that's a huge part of our vision for our new space, is a space that's open all day round, welcoming to anybody. Everybody feels that it's their space, a space where people feel like it's an extension of their own living room. And I really look forward to having a cup of tea with you in the new space when we're open. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you found that interesting. We're here for throughout the rest of the week. We live stream every day at 1 o'clock on Facebook and Instagram. I do hope you'll join us then. Thanks so much. Bye.